Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome back to the Lockdown LitFest. We hope you are enjoying what we're doing. We hope that you're keeping safe and keeping well. And we hope that you have subscribed to our newsletter through the website, www.lockdownlitfest.com, and subscribed also to our YouTube channel, which is really simple. And we'll keep you in touch with what we're doing and the fantastic palette of authors, writers, thinkers, and poets that we're providing for you by way of being the first digitally native literary festival. I'll get my words right in a minute. We have a bit of a treat in store for you today. Julia Johnson is a drama teacher turned children's author, storyteller, and performer who first landed in Dubai in 1975. She's appeared on stage, TV, and radio in the UK and in Dubai, and has toured theatre in education productions for schools and has recorded no fewer than 100 audiobooks. Her stories frequently focus on the history and culture of the Arabian Peninsula, and she's written over a dozen stories for children, including The Camel That Got Away, Humpy Grumpy's Mission Improbable, and Ubuntu, Summer of the Rhino, which was produced in partnership with Rhino Revolution. Her fantastic book, The Turtle's Secret, won the Best International Children's Book Award at the Sharjah International Book Fair in 2014, and her book, The Secret of the Cave, also won in 2018. It is my huge pleasure and honour to say, Julia Johnson, a very warm welcome to the Lockdown LitFest.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for having me. The honour is all mine.
Oh, no, believe you me, the honour and pleasure is ours. I've rather given the game away, but you are not in the UK. You are in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates.
I certainly am, where it's getting hotter and hotter.
How hot? Give us an idea.
Well, at this time of day, it's about 44 degrees.
My goodness me. Well, a good time to be sitting inside writing or sitting inside appearing at a literary festival.
Absolutely.
I'd like to, because you've done so much, and as I tried to give away really in the introduction, there's a lot that underpins your storytelling. And if you don't mind, I'd like to do a little voyage around your career as a writer. And as any good voyage, it starts with a beginning. What was the start point? Can I assume that you were brought up in a bookish family? Were you an inveterate story consumer?
Yes, indeed, I was. My mother and father both loved books and shared their love of literature with us. And my mother was very good at making up stories, and she loved poetry too. And my father liked poetry. His was a different kind of poetry. He liked funny poems, particularly like Lewis Carroll's Jabberwock and that sort of thing. But he liked words, and I think that came from him, well, from both of them. And my mother was a huge animal lover. So my sister and I were fed a diet of animal stories, which is probably my love of animals comes from her. When we were little, we had lots of pets. We had rabbits and guinea pigs and a dog and all the usual things. And my mother was the sort of person who, if she saw an animal in need of help, if she could help it, she would stop and help it. And she's rescued chickens from lorries where they weren't packed properly and torn a strip off a great big lorry driver who went off with his tail between his legs. She got a pet shop closed down for a week because they weren't looking after their terrapins properly in oxygenated water. So she was quite a determined person, and she was small but fierce, as they say.
And where was this, Julia? Where was your childhood?
I grew up in Yorkshire until I was 17 when we moved to Worcestershire. So, yes, the Yorkshire moors and Huddersfield was the actual town that I grew up in.
And I assume from education, you were obviously a keen reader. You obviously liked education. You then went to become a teacher. What drove that?
I think really I wanted to become an actress. Although looking back now, I think if I had my time over again, I'd like to be a wildlife presenter because, of course, David Attenborough is one of my greatest heroes. But my father and my mother were both rather anti going into the acting profession. I suppose back then it wasn't as, and I don't think I was as determined as I could have been. I don't think I was a strong enough personality really to fight them. And so in the end, I opted for a drama course and became a teacher. But still with a great love of drama, and did a lot of amateur performances and some professional performances as well. So I got into it later by the back door.
I rather like the circularity, that having been inspired as a young mind by the passions of your father and your mother, that you then inspired young minds. Was that rewarding?
Very rewarding. And one of the things that I most enjoyed doing was theatre in education.
Right.
I started my own company here in Dubai because when we came to Dubai in 1975, it was a place where you could make all sorts of things happen. It was a really buzzy place with masses of opportunities. And I still think it is quite like that, but it was even more so back then. I started a theatre and education company called Caravan, like a camel caravan, because we toured around schools throughout the Emirates. And I originally started drama workshops for children. And it was the mothers of some of the children who came to me and said, look, I'm sick of hearing about what a good time Simon had in your workshop. We want to do something too. What can we do? So I dragged a group of people together of like mind, and we set up Caravan, and we improvised and made up stories on issues and topics and took them around schools. So that was how it all began, really. And so that we didn't forget the stories that we'd improvised, we wrote them down. And I've always written things down, and I've always acted. I mean, my mother was, she had a fantastic dressing up box when we were little. And of course, back in those days, people wore hats and gloves and ball gowns and all sorts. So the dressing up box was full of delightful things. And I used to make up plays with my sister. I was the director because I was 4 years older. And we used to inflict them on our grandfather when he came to tea on a Sunday, until, the parents would say, mother and father would say, I think that's enough now, darling. Or, have you finished now? And start applauding. We'd say, no, it's not finished yet.
I like that you said with your theatre and education in Dubai in the 70s, you were writing stories about issues and themes. What sort of issues were you discussing? Because, of course, we have to remember Dubai has grown like Topsy in the last 2 decades. So 40 years ago or so, it was a very different place from the place that it is now.
It is indeed. In fact, I don't think we started the theatre and education till the 80s, but even then, not a fat lot of difference. We sort of topics, we did things about colour, about bullying, about friendship, about 5 senses. And we made all the stories up and toured schools with them. Yes, so all sorts of different topics. We used to have a look at what schools were studying and see how we could fit in with the curriculum, because then, of course, schools were much more inclined to buy us in. And we performed to children in a circle with a screen behind us. And I mean, all sorts of things went wrong. We had an amazing time. I do wish I'd kept a diary, because so many things went wrong. We were driving to Ras Al Khaimah one day, and we had dry ice in a cauldron in the back of a Jeep. And the lid blew off, and this dry ice went and disappeared in the air. So we didn't have our sort of steamy atmospheric dry ice for the actual show. But, I mean, that was just an added bonus. It didn't matter. But it was, all sorts of funny things. We had one of the actors who was playing a witch lost her voice. And so we had to rope in somebody else literally hours before the performance, because this was a ticketed performance. So we couldn't cancel or postpone. And she kept come behind the screen and say, what next? And we'd sort of tell her and push her on. And she was absolutely brilliant. She had actually seen the production, so she knew vaguely what she was doing. And of course, being improvised, that meant that we could actually help her out if she got stuck by asking her a question in role. So I love improvisation.
Leonard Cohen, of course, famously wrote that the cracks are where the light gets in. It's always fascinated me that it's usually the things that go wrong that become the stories that we tell about how we did the thing we did. And it's when things go wrong that the interest really sparks. Michael Morpurgo has explained in the past to me and to literary festival audiences around the world that he started writing children's stories by telling kids stories, because after lunch when he was teaching, they were sleepy, he couldn't get them to engage with work. So he'd make stories up, and he started writing them the night before, so that they had a 15, 20-minute story to settle down after lunch with before they could get back to learning. When did you start to leverage your theatre and education, the stories that you were telling through theatre and education, and thought, well, actually, these might be good books. These might be really good stories for parents to read at bedtime, for children to read by themselves. Did it work like that, or have I made a terrible assumption?
Well, it possibly should have worked like that, but it didn't. It was very rough the way I wrote things down, just to keep track of what we were doing. Sometimes we scripted them as well, but we kept them as plays rather than stories. And actually, it's only this last book that I've written, The Stories of Lizard and Toad, which I've used two of the stories that I did more recently in theatre and education with a friend. And in fact, it was stories of Frog and Toad that we did, and loosely based on the Arnold Lobel stories of Frog and Toad. And we transported them to a wadi setting, and a wadi being the river or pool that runs through the mountains in Arabia after the rain. And she was Frog and I was Toad because she could jump higher than me. She was a dancer. So two of these stories, I thought actually they would make good stories to read aloud. And then I thought, well, actually, I could have some stories about a lizard or two creatures that live in a wadi, and I could tell lots of different stories about them. Two creatures who are friends. I opted for a lizard rather than a frog because actually we don't have frogs here in Arabia. We have Arabian toads. So I wanted to get that right.
Very nicely done. Can we come back to one of your early stories? A Gift of the Sands was published in 2004. Was that one of the first stories? I know prior to that you'd written A is for Arabic to help kids who
A is
were
for
not...
Arabia.
A
yes.
is for Arabia, forgive me, to start to learn the Arabic language. But in the first of your storybooks, what did you start with? The
very first one was The Pearl Diver.
Of course.
And that actually, it all really happened by accident. I came back to live in Dubai after being away for 12 years. Brian and I had actually left Dubai in 1989. We had 12 years in England when our children were growing up. And within a year of leaving, he actually entered a competition for the Crete Golf Club, which he won. So he set up an office back here, an architectural practice. And he toed and froed because he had an office in the UK by this time anyway. And over the years, obviously, he got busier here. So in the end, I decided that I'd come back and make my life here again. And I thought, what am I going to do this time? I don't really want to do theatre this time. And I don't want to tie in with lots of other people because I want to be free to travel back home. I just had my first grandchild and I've got 5 now. So, I wanted to be able to see them as and when I wanted. So I thought, well, I could take stories around schools. I could tell stories, and I'll tell stories about the sea because the sea's played such an important part in Dubai and the Arabian Gulf. And I must have a story about pearl diving because I'd been fascinated by pearl diving ever since I first arrived in Dubai in 1975 when the museum had just opened. And they had an exhibition there, and I was just fascinated by it. It was such an alien thing and so hard, and I thought the pearl divers should be celebrated. So I went looking for a story and I couldn't find one. And that's when I thought, because of course the Arab tradition is oral storytelling.
Yes.
So in fact, there are lots of things to actually write about out here which haven't been written about. And I hope that's what I'm doing. And so I thought, well, I can write a story. And after that, everything just fell into place. Brian was reading a newspaper one morning and read about an old man living in an old people's home who was a pearl diver, or had been when he was young. And so I thought, oh, right, bring him up, do some research. Yes, I could go and see him. And he told me his stories. I met all sorts of interesting people. So I wrote the story and then I showed it to Isobel because I thought, actually, maybe I could do more than just tell this story. I mean, maybe it's good enough to publish. I'm not sure. So Isobel Abulhoul, the now director, was the director of the Emirates Literature Festival. Back then, she was running Magrudy's. She'd She'd opened Magrudy's bookshop and educational toys. And I thought she was a good person running a bookshop, because she's an avid reader, to look at my story. She loved it, and she recommended a publisher who specialised in books on the Middle East. And he loved the story. And he said, "Have you written any more?" And I said, "Well, no, but I think I can." So that's how it all started.
And how many books now later?
Oh, 23, 22, something like that.
23, 22. And
And
I'd
a
rather
few
like
waiting in the wings.
Exactly. I like that you started with the pearl diver one, because of course Dubai famously was a small settlement built on pearl diving, and that
Absolutely.
when artificial pearls were invented in the 1920s, they had to completely rejig their whole model, their whole economy.
Well, yes, I think they were very poor as a result, because the bottom dropped out of the Gulf pearl market because
Absolutely.
Gulf pearls are so expensive.
And I understand from Sheikh Mohammed that that's when the creek was dredged and it became a port for the spice trade from between India and Mozambique and East Africa, and led to the Dubai that we know today.
Absolutely. And for hundreds of years, they depended on pearl diving, and
Absolutely.
They did it in the same way for hundreds of years, just with a peg on their noses, a lead weight on their ankles, and a basket around their necks for the oysters.
Absolutely. You gave a little clue into your latest book, which is called Lizard and Toad. Would you have a copy there you could show us?
I would.
Because one of the things I'd like to talk about is the fantastic illustrations that you do for your books.
Can you see it?
If you could lower it, that's marvelous. Lizard and Toad. Thank you, Julia. Now we know what it looks like. Can you just tell us a little bit about all your books are beautifully illustrated. And can you tell us who illustrated Lizard and Toad and what the illustrations mean to you?
Well, Lizard and Toad was illustrated by an American lady called Natalie Merheb. And she's used digital and computerized images, which she's obviously done initially. I think she's made them real characters. I think that particularly for this story, the characters need to come out. They're amusing. She's got a sense of humour, and I think that comes out in the stories as well. Nice and colourful. And for some of my stories, just not wishing to give my daughter a plug, but Emily, my daughter, has illustrated quite a few of my books. She's an artist. And she did the Humpy Grumpy series, the Humpy Grumpy Camel series, and quite a few others. So I have a sort of stable of illustrators. And the very first person was Patricia al-Fakhri, who illustrated The Pearl Diver. And that was very atmospheric watercolours. So I think, the illustrations vary considerably depending on the age group, and depending on how many of them there are, and depending on the atmosphere that you're trying to create.
Absolutely. All good atmosphere starts with a good story, though, Julia. And would you do us the honour of reading an extract from Lizard and Toad?
Yes, I can read you one little story, because the thing is, Lizard and Toad are 4 stories in one book. And the cover I showed you was the first book, and that came out in February. The second book is due to come out, I think, quite soon. Let's hope. Sorry I can't show you the illustrations, but hopefully my voice will paint a picture for you. So
it'll be a treat in store for those who buy the book.
Yes. So this one's called Toad Makes a Splash. Last night it rained. Toad is very happy. His pool is full again. Lizard is doing push-ups on his rock. Good morning, Lizard, says Toad. A perfect day for a swim. Fancy a dip? But Lizard is busy counting his push-ups and doesn't reply. Toad is feeling pleased with himself. Look, he croaks, pointing to a string of black eggs. Soon there will be lots more toads. And he dives into his pool with a big splash. First he swims on his front, then he swims on his back. Look at me, Lizard, he shouts. But Lizard doesn't look. Toad hops out of the water onto a rock. Look at me, Toad shouts to some birds as he leaps off the rock and somersaults through the air before plunging into the water. But when he climbs out of the water, the birds don't shout bravo. They're too busy taking a bath. Some cars arrive in the wadi. The birds fly into a tree and Lizard scurries off to hide, but Toad isn't frightened. Boys and girls spill out of the cars. They look around and write things down in notebooks. Oh, look at this dragonfly, calls a boy, taking a photo. And this pretty butterfly, calls a small girl. Hey, what about me? Croaks Toad. Why don't you look at me? And he puffs out his cheeks. Come and look at these fish, says another boy. There are loads of them. But what about me? Cries Toad. Look at me. And he puffs out his chest. Look what I found, shouts a girl excitedly, pointing at a scorpion. Hey, you haven't looked at me yet, mutters Toad crossly. I'm much more interesting than a silly old scorpion. Besides, scorpions sting. And he puffs himself up until he feels big enough to burst. Have you seen this grasshopper? A grown-up calls. It can jump really high. That's nothing, shouts Toad angrily. I'm the best jumper in the whole wadi. Just watch me. With that, he takes an enormous leap and somersaults through the air 3 times before landing in the water with a huge splash. When he comes back to the surface, he hears lots of clicks as they all point their cameras at him. It's a toad, shouts a boy, a big one. Look, he's got bulgy eyes and lots of warts. And, thinks Toad, it must be a very special sort of toad to be able to do somersaults, says one of the grown-ups. That's better, thinks Toad. I like special. And he hops onto a rock so that they can see him more clearly. Yes, says another grown-up. We should have a closer look at him. And suddenly, Toad finds himself scooped up and shoved into a big glass jar. Should I go on, or shall I leave it at that?
I think we leave it there. I think it's a lovely place to leave it. What sort of age group is that aimed at, Julia?
I think 5, 6, 7-year-olds, either stories to share with parents or stories to read for themselves.
And just for those who are gasping with the suspense, does Toad survive all right?
Oh yes, because his friend Lizard always has a very good plan and clever plan to get him out of difficulties. So that's the premise, that Lizard always gets Toad out of problem situations, and the problems only occur when people come into the wadi.
You may have just witnessed our first lockdown LitFest spoiler alert, which I should have put perhaps before I asked Julia.
Oh yes. Never mind, plenty more stories to read.
There are plenty more stories in Lizard and Toad, both volumes. Julie, there's a book I'd like to talk to you about, which is rather a special one, because it's one that I think you and I discussed before at the Emirates Airline Festival of Literature, and it's one that I have bought innumerable copies of for various nieces, godchildren, and so on. It's called The Turtle Secret. And it does rather an extraordinary thing. And I like that you said earlier on about your theatre in education, about talking about issues and talking about ideas. And The Turtle Secret does something that a lot of your books do, which give a window into Emirati culture, in which you've obviously immersed yourself, you've done lots of research. They give an insight into the Arabic language. But this one does something which I think is the first one of yours that does. It may still be the only one, which discusses the role of women in Emirati culture. Can you tell us what the idea was for The Turtle Secret, what you set out to write, and how you handled it?
Well, first of all, I decided I wanted to write a story about turtles because I was interested in them as an endangered species. And then I thought, how about if I had an Emirati girl as the heroine rather than a boy? It's very easy to write, to choose your characters as boys in this part of the world. But actually, girls, particularly nowadays, are doing all sorts of fantastic things. So I decided to have a girl, and then I decided to look at some of the issues. If she wanted to become a marine biologist, would it be difficult for her? And I think it very much depends on the family's support. So I actually went into a school that is just for Emirati girls, and the Latifa School for girls. And a teacher set up a meeting for me with 15-year-olds. older. They were not the sort of age range I was aiming at, but I wanted their opinion about my thoughts. And I said, do you think that from the point of view of what she'd have to wear to be a marine biologist, about issues to do with leaving home and perhaps going abroad to study? And they were very wise, actually. And one of them said, well, this girl in your story is only 10. So in 8 years' time, the world will have changed, and the Emirates will have grown a lot more accepting, and also you're giving us a role model, and I think that's very important, she said. And I thought, oh, thank you, that's great, that's perfect. And so I sounded them out with lots of things that I'd included in the story, and they felt that it was okay. And they were all from quite different families, some who were brought up pretty strictly, and others who had a more laissez-faire sort of attitude, and were allowed out with friends to do all sorts of things, but others who were rather more kept at home. So it was interesting. It was a really good, worthwhile discussion, and I gained a lot from that.
What has the response to it been? Because, of course, I'm aware that while you and I are having this conversation, the Emirati mission to Mars is either about to launch or has already launched.
Well, it was supposed to. I think it's launching on Friday now.
It's launching on Friday, and of course, it's headed up by the UAE Minister of State for Advanced Technology or Sciences, who's Sarah al-Amiri, who is the Emirati's leading scientist in many ways.
Yes.
So I'm guessing things have changed a lot since you wrote Turtle Secret.
Well, I think they have. But a lot of the things in it are still culturally resonant. I mean, things like food, things like prayer, I included something that was an insult. So, for instance, in the story, one of Hessa's friends gives her a turtle egg, and Hessa is hugely affronted because she said, where did you get it? And she said, oh, my brother gave it to me. And I said, well, she says, well, your brother shouldn't have taken it. He's a thief. They should be left in the turtle's nest. Mm. And of course, the girl takes huge umbrage at the fact of being called a thief. We all would, of course we would. But I think that the knock-on effect on the Emirati's dignity in this particular story was perhaps greater. So there were all sorts of things there that I felt I could include in the story to resonate. And I hope that the stories are read by, I think they are, by both locals, Emiratis, and by expatriates. Because, my feeling is the reason I really started was because I felt that we should have a window into Emirati culture. We shouldn't just come here and live here. Children should be educated about the history and culture and people of the country that they're living in. I mean, surely they're curious. I know we were when we first came. We were incredibly curious and still are. And it's curiosity that fuels stories, I think.
It's the question I was going to ask you is, what sort of response do you get from your Emirati readers, and how does it differ, if it differs, from your expat readers?
Emirati readers tend to be extremely grateful. And they often say, oh, gosh, that's fantastic. How do you know so much about us? And I said, well, I've been here longer than you've been alive. So, I've had a bit of experience. And they said, well, you've done a lot of research, and we really appreciate that you're writing stories. And I try and encourage them to write stories. And in fact, of course, there are a lot more Emiratis writing stories themselves now than there were back then. I think, I sort of started a trend, but of course they really know more, of course they do, about their own culture and heritage. And I try and encourage Emirati listeners to go home and speak to their grandparents, because very soon the stories that are in their grandparents' heads will of course die with them unless they're passed on. And I said, you've got this wonderful cupboard full of stories in your grandparents, if you're still lucky enough to have your grandparents alive. So go and ask them about their childhoods and how different they were, and write things down before you forget them.
Let's, for 2 minutes, have a Julia Johnson masterclass on story writing. So if one of your listeners or readers takes your advice, goes and talks to their grandparents, finds a story, what would you say is, what have you learned from your own writing, is the essence of a good story? How should someone start to write a good story, other than having a beginning, middle, and end?
Well, yes, that's true. I think to be a good writer, you need to be very observant. So you need to tease out from your grandparents, if that's the way you're going to start. You need to tease out the subtleties and not take things on face value. Ask them questions that are searching to get beneath their story. Ask them about their feelings. Empathize with the characters that you're creating. I mean, I think empathy is hugely important. And even though I'm not an Emirati, I can empathize with my Emirati characters. So I think all those things are very, very important.
What are the mistakes people make? What would you suggest people avoid doing if they embark on writing a story for some of your younger readers?
Try not to say the same thing over and over again. Don't believe that being a long story makes a good story. Just because you can write doesn't mean it's necessarily a good story. I think short and sweet. I think pare things down, cut them. Try a story out on a friend. Seek feedback, constructive criticism. I mean, I always do that. I'm very lucky because my husband's very supportive and will listen. And my daughter's got plenty of ideas because she draws illustrations. And my son is an Arabist, and he not only studied the language, he spent 6 months in Syria, 6 months in Lebanon, a year in Alexandria. He really understands, or has, maybe understands is the wrong word, he's got under the skin of Muslim culture. And so he's very good at advising me. And if I want to use an Arabic turn of phrase or something, he's very good at. But he takes it upon himself to give me complete criticism. You know, it's not just the little bits I've asked him about. I get a full crit back from him.
Excellent. Juliet, we go out to an international audience around the world. For people that are not familiar with Emirati culture, for people that are not familiar with your writing, what would you say to somebody, say, living in Brazil? Why should they pick up one of your books? How would you pitch it to them as something that is an interesting way to find out about Emirati culture?
Well, I think it's always interesting to know more about people in different parts of the world. That's one of the reasons I love travel, because you get to meet so many interesting people. I was thinking this morning, it's one of the reasons that I love Dubai. We go for an early morning walk on the beach. And of course, there are lots of people walking on the beach at 6:30 in the morning from all over the world. And you hear lots of different languages being spoken. You see lots of different coloured skins of people as they walk along. And I find that very charming. I also like to think about, you know, who these people are when they go home and have a shower and put on their clothes. Who are they? On the beach, everybody's sort of anybody, you know, we're all a sort of hodgepodge and in our shorts and swimming costumes and things. So I like that. But I think, you know, that I want to read stories about people from other parts of the world. I want to understand how the world ticks. I want to feel empathy with other cultures, with other people. I'd be interested in reading stories about Brazil, and so I hope Brazilians would be interested in reading stories about the Emirates.
Thank you, Julia. Now, a little bird tells me you've been working on a new book, and it's called Where Is Everyone?
That's true.
And another little bird tells me that you may have a copy to hand, and you may, if I can be imposed upon you and sweet talk you into it, be prepared to give us a world exclusive, which is the first literary festival reading from a book that hasn't yet been published. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, indeed. Well, this one, just to give you a little bit of background, I felt quite doleful at the beginning of this lockdown. I felt down, I felt depressed. It wasn't just because of the lockdown. We have a new grandson. He's 6 months old now. He was born very prematurely. He came out of hospital in February, but a month later, he had to go back into hospital with a respiratory infection. So I was feeling quite down about this. I hasten to add that he's fine, he's looking robust, he's looking amazing. But for a month, it was a bit touch and go, I think, certainly at the beginning. So I didn't feel inspired at all. And then when he came out of hospital, suddenly this black cloud lifted. And all of a sudden, I was able to see things more clearly, and I started taking much more of an interest in what was going on around me, really. And I noticed that one of the things that intrigued me was the way animals were taking over cities where people, because they were quiet, no traffic, no people, animals such as, I think you've had goats in Llandudno.
Exactly.
Deer, monkeys,
Cougars in Chicago and moose in Montreal.
So this started me thinking, and I thought, I wonder what the camels are feeling like, because I do love camels. And I thought, gosh, they won't have seen their trainers for quite a long time. I wonder how they're doing. And it was this sort of mulling, I do a lot of mulling and daydreaming and sitting looking outside the window because we've got lots of birds out here, which help me to freshen up and feel like writing a story. So I always find looking at birds quite inspirational. And so I wrote, Where is Everyone? And so I'll show you the mock-up cover. Whoops.
Fantastic.
And my daughter said, oh, please, Mum, do put some other animals in, not just camels. I've had enough drawing camels. But it does begin with the camels. So this is the first little bit. The camels were bored. It's been weeks since we've seen a person, they grumbled. It was true. They hadn't seen anyone for a very long time. Where's Ali? Whispered the littlest camel. Where have our trainers gone? Asked another. When are we going to race again? All the camels loved racing. They loved the fun and excitement. They loved the yelling and the cheering. And they loved the sticky dates which their trainers gave them to say, well done. And what about a beauty contest? We haven't had one for ages and ages. All the camels sighed. They hadn't been groomed for weeks. No shampooing, no brushing, no shoe shine. Where's Ali? Squeaked the littlest camel. And we haven't had any singing and dancing. This was true too. No weddings, no festivals, no celebrations, not even a group of tourists to ride on their backs. At least we have plenty of food, one of them said. There had been lots of rain that winter, and now all sorts of delicious plants were growing in the desert. We may not be beauty queens or racing champions, but at least we're strong and our humps aren't saggy. But what about the humans? What can have happened to them? They asked each other again. Where's Ali? Demanded the littlest camel. The camels looked at each other. We might be fit and healthy, but perhaps there's something wrong with the humans. They looked at their leader. The oldest camel in the herd was thoughtful. Let's go to the city and find out, he said.
Julia Johnson reading there from her latest work, not yet published, entitled Where is Everyone? When is it due out, Julia?
Well, hopefully the first day of the autumn term. And I've written a teacher's pack to go with it because I think books are always more appreciated if there's lots of follow-up ideas as well.
Well, excellent. We shall try and give that a plug in the beginning of autumn term. But in the meantime, you have Lizard and Toad, which you can buy and read that. Just one small thing. We don't have much time, but I need to ask you this because a lot of people will be saying, wait, what? Hold on. Camels? Beauty contests? Now, you and I know about these, but can you please give a very short description of the reality of a camel beauty contest?
Oh, yes. The beauty contest is a great big deal here. And camels are prized and sell for thousands of dollars. And their eyelashes, the shape of their humps, their legs, their colour, their fur, their lips, everything is very important. And so camel beauty contests really do happen.
And those winners of the contest can go for a fair old amount of money.
They certainly can, worth a fortune. Yeah.
Worth a fortune. And racing camels go for millions and millions and millions.
They do indeed. So camels are extremely important and just demand to be in stories. I mean, I just love camels because they've got such funny faces and such rubbery lips, so expressive. So I have them in rather a lot of stories.
One of the things that people that don't really know much about camels, that everybody seems to know about them, is that they spit. Is that actually true?
But they spit?
Spit.
Yes, they do. They do spit. They can be quite bad-tempered, I think, and their tongues sort of lollop out, and they do spit and foam. They can look quite repulsive at times, but they can also look very appealing.
I once had the pleasure of getting to know a camel at a poetry gala in the desert. And I have to say, it's the first time I got up close to the face of a camel. My God, they truly are beautiful.
Yes, they are.
Blown away. They're just wonderful creatures. Julia, it's been lovely talking to you. If you had to give a final message to your readers, what would you like to say to your readers? I know one of the joys of a literary festival is that authors get to meet their readers, and readers the authors that create the stories. So assuming you have hundreds of your readers watching in right now, what would you like to say to them?
Well, of course, I hope you enjoy my stories. I hope you take away perhaps a little message, because quite a few of my stories, I hope, give a subtle message. And I hope that as a result of that maybe you feel empowered, my readers, to do something about the state of the planet. That's why I wrote Where Is Everyone? I think I was hoping that this pandemic would result in everybody being a lot kinder to the planet and having more respect for nature and wildlife. And that's one of the things I do try to put across in my stories.
Indeed, you're a very good advocate, not only for Emirati culture, but also for the marine biology of the Gulf. Is there something else you wanted to say, Julia?
Well, I was just going to add that I was very, very lucky. This last festival, I met Gavin Thurston, who has written a book called The Secret Life of a Cameraman, Journeys into the Wild. I went to his session. I loved his book. He's won all sorts of awards and filmed with on David Attenborough's programs, Blue Planet and so on. And we got talking to him at the festival. He was very sweet, very down to earth, very nice. He expressed an interest in the sort of stories I write. I sent him a few. And then I asked him, would he mind reading Where Is Everyone, with a view to giving me a foreword if he liked it. And he did. He's given me a foreword, which I thought was extremely kind of him. So, and I would highly recommend his book. It was just lovely. Have you read it?
Have you finished plugging everybody now? I haven't read it yet, no. Let's just wrap up. Thank you so much for that, Julia. Julia, thank you for that lovely message to your readers. A very important message right now. We can but hope that in the midst of COVID-19 and the worldwide pandemic, that we haven't forgotten our responsibilities to this planet, which was, of course, uppermost in the news before this vile virus descended upon us.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming to join us here at the Lockdown LitFest, Julia Johnson. Thank you so much for two rather lovely readings of your work. How lucky we are to have the doyen of so many audiobooks reading from her own work for us here at Lockdown. Please look after yourself in Dubai, and thank you so much for coming to join us.
Thank you, Paul.
So there we are, Julia Johnson, and over 20 books you can choose from. Go and have a look at her website, which we'll have a link on, I'm sure, on our own website. There'll be a buy the book button below. And as ever, thank you so much for coming to join us. We do value your time. We hope we give you value in terms of the variety and interesting events and authors that we present for you. Thank you for joining us here at the Lockdown LitFest. Cheerio.